Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Michael Saylor from the History Department, and I want to welcome you to the annual Eugene Lunn Memorial Lecture. Eugene Lunn was an esteemed member of the Davis Department of History. In his 20 years here, he distinguished himself as a scholar in the field of modern European intellectual history. He was a passionate and productive researcher, but no less an engaged and charismatic teacher. In his memory, a fund was assembled to support an annual lecture featuring notable scholars whose work has inspired their colleagues as well as the broader public. The lecture series has become an important tradition here at Davis, made possible by the generous donations of many people here today. In particular, I'd like to thank our chair, David Beal, and Monica Fisher, who helped greatly with the arrangements for this event. And I'd also like to give a special thanks to Michael Tenefoss, a UC Davis alumnus, who wished to honor the impact that Eugene Lunn had on him and has given us a very generous donation, one that will enable us actually to continue this lecture series for 5 years and also to tape the lecture and present it on the departmental website. And we will be doing that with all the future Lunn lectures. So I think that it's particularly fitting for this first open access Lunn lecture that we have as our speaker Robert Darnton, the Carl H. Forsheimer University Professor and Director of the Harvard University Library. Historians are trained to be very good at hindsight. They are not socialized to be prophets. Nevertheless, Robert Darnton can be called a visionary. This past February, President Obama awarded him the 2011 National Humanities Medal for his, quote, determination to make knowledge accessible to everyone, unquote. This is but one of his many awards, which include a Rhodes Scholarship, a MacArthur Prize, and the 1995 National Book Critics Circle Award for his history, The Forbidden Bestsellers of Pre-Revolutionary France. As an historian of the Enlightenment, Robert Darnton has been avidly tracing how knowledge became accessible to many in the 18th century, particularly in France. At the beginning of his career as a historian at Princeton, he widened the contours of Enlightenment scholarship by exploring the interchange between elite texts and popular culture in such works as The Literary Underground of the Old Regime and The Great Cat Massacre, an evocative title. The Social History of Ideas, with its mantra of out of the armchair and into the archives, caused consternation among some of the more traditional intellectual historians who weren't used to seeing the refined writings of Voltaire and Rousseau paired with those of Grub Street hacks and sleazy pornographers. But Darnton's approach, which drew on cultural anthropology, was to have a central influence on the development of the new cultural history of the 1980s. Further, his concern with the broad diffusion and measurable impact of ideas led him to become one of the pioneers of the new interdisciplinary field of the history of the book. Here, books are situated within systems of communication, and his own contributions to this field excel at presenting the larger picture alongside the telling detail. When he joined the Harvard History faculty in 2007, his expertise led him to become director of the university library. In recent years, he has been drawing on his historical perspective to assess the future of electronic books, scholarly publishing, and digital libraries, particularly in The Case for Books, Past, Present, and Future. Tonight, he will speak to us on Books, Digits, and Dollars, a Design for the Future. Please join me in welcoming Robert Darnton.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted and honored to be here to give the Lunn Lecture. I'm not going to inhabit the 18th century in this lecture. It's really where I feel most comfortable, but I'm going to be, I hope you won't be uncomfortable, but I'm going to be trying to make an argument for a new kind of library. It's what we call the Digital Public Library of America, DPLA, and I'd like to do so by contrasting two tendencies that run through the history of books: democratization and commercialization. To put it so baldly, however, is I think, to run the risk of stranding the argument on some high moral ground, sounding off as if you're in favor of, well, motherhood and apple pie, or fatherhood, I should say, and apple pie. And that's not what I want to do. I don't want to give you a harangue about high principle, but I want to locate my argument on another level, the level of can-do, pragmatic level, because we really want to create this new DPLA, a new kind of library. So what I propose to do is to discuss a difficult terrain towards an elevated goal, if you want to put it like that. That is to say, a library that will make our country's cultural heritage available free of charge to all of our countrymen and countrywomen, in fact, to everyone in the world. But that, I admit, does have a utopian ring to it. And I might as well confess at the outset to some sympathy for utopianism. I think it challenges the assumption that the way things are is the way they have to be, and that the everyday, workaday world is firmly fixed in what we take to be reality. History shows that things can fall apart, sometimes in a way that releases utopian energy. Revolutions often produce such an effect, and therefore I will cite some revolutionary changes, even though it raises the danger of confusing history with homily. Let me begin by invoking the ideal of openness. Digitize, democratize. Openness is, well, it's a happy notion which calls up felicitous associations. Open-minded, open market, open covenants, openly arrived at, the song of the open road. In the world of libraries, openness has a particularly positive ring, thanks to the movement for open access, which promises to open up books and journal articles for the benefit of everyone. But libraries have frequently been closed. From what little we know about the ancient library of Alexandria, it functioned primarily to store texts, not to make them available to readers. It admitted a few scholars, that's true, but its main purpose, we don't really know, but it probably was to embody the magnificence of the Ptolemaic dynasties. I sometimes imagine it as a kind of pyramid composed of texts. Some of the ancient libraries of China also magnified the glory of the emperors and preserved books by removing them from readers. In order to assemble his so-called Four Treasures library, the Emperor Qing Lung appropriated books from his subjects on a gigantic scale during an inquisition from 1772 to 1788. They provided material for encyclopedias and anthologies that reinforced his authority, and anything remotely critical of the Qing dynasty or favorable to the Mings, at least 2,320 books produced between 1550 and 1750 was burned. So we've got a library for purging literature and burning a good deal of it. The communist regime in Czechoslovakia used the country's libraries to purge literature rather than to preserve it. In 1954, it ordered all local librarians to cleanse their shelves of works that fit into categories that actually ranged from the expected, fascism, pornography, to the bizarre, formalism, ruralism, and snobism. I imagine the Czech communists purging not Trotskyism, but snobism from the shelves of their libraries. I don't know what books they actually got rid of, but they did get rid of a total of 7,500 works. My point is simply that the history of libraries, which always sounds elevated and high-minded, actually has a dark side. Far from demonstrating uninterrupted democratization in access to knowledge, it sometimes illustrates the opposite. Knock, and it shall be closed. As testimony to this theme, I would like to cite Thomas Hardy's great last novel, Jude the Obscure, published in 1895. Its hero, Jude Fawley, is a working-class lad consumed with the ambition to penetrate into the closed world of learning, which is epitomized by Christminster, a thinly disguised, fictionalized version of Oxford University. Having taught himself Latin and Greek, Jude deserves to be admitted into one of the university's colleges, but he is kept out by the barriers of class. He works as a stonemason and never gets beyond repairing the walls that shut the colleges off from the outside world. So I'm going to flash some pictures of the walls of Oxford, and you get the idea right away. They've got crenellations, they've got all kinds of bars to keep the public out. When I was a student at Oxford, 65 years after Hardy published his novel, the walls still looked formidable. The massive gate of my college slammed shut at 10 o'clock in the evening, and if you hadn't made it inside, you had to climb over one of those walls. It was a daunting experience because the walls were 10 to 15 feet high, and they bristled at the top with shards of glass and spikes. Now, a few secret passages existed, but even they were treacherous, as you can see from this photo, which shows me posing with a friend at one of my favorite entry points, where you had to slip in between rows of fixed and revolving spikes. So the spikes on the top are fixed, but the ones I'm holding on to revolved, and to squeeze between the two was not easy. Well, I will flash more pictures of Oxford walls and spikes as accompaniment to the rest of my remarks, which are actually aimed at the invisible barriers to knowledge, especially the knowledge contained in libraries. Most Oxford libraries are walled inside the colleges. Even the Bodleian Library of the university, which you see here, has the air of a fortress with crenellations and iron gates. Libraries everywhere in the world frequently keep outsiders outside by all sorts of measures: locked doors, turnstiles, restrictive qualifications for entry, payment to obtain a reader's card, and an atmosphere of intimidation. Now, I'm sure you don't do this here at Davis, but it's hard for many of us in universities to imagine how off-putting and frightening libraries can be for ordinary people who don't go to universities. These ordinary folk hesitate to brave these barriers, and they are kept at a distance by the learned elite who wear an air of effortless superiority, which corresponds to the social sifting that the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu described as distinction, a way of creating barriers that are invisible. Oxford students captured this intellectual hauteur in verse, which they aimed at Benjamin Jowett, the master of Balliol College, Oxford, who was also reviled in Jude the Obscure. Here come I, my name is Jowett. All there is to know, I know it. I am master of this college. What I know not is not knowledge. Well, this kind of, makes you think maybe the Czechs were right to purge snobism. A counter-tendency gathered force in the Age of Enlightenment, when spreading light became identified with reading books. The French Royal Library began to admit readers in 1692, although not very many. In fact, the royal librarian often invited them, gave them a free lunch on Thursdays. That's how few there were. I see some people standing. There are seats here. Please come and have a seat up front. The British Museum was opened to the public in 1759. In the United States, the first large public library was established in Boston in 1848, and it allowed any citizen to borrow books and take them home to read, which was quite an innovation. The New York Public Library opened its great collections to the public in 1911 and opened them to anyone who simply walked in from the street. It served as an informal university for generations of immigrants who wanted both instruction and access to the literature in their native languages. So the New York Public Library has great collections in Yiddish and Chinese and Italian and so on. We often refer to it as the People's University. Andrew Carnegie financed the creation of 39 branch libraries throughout New York, while paying $40 million, which was a lot of money way back then, to build 1,697 community libraries everywhere in the country between 1886 and 1919. So the story begins to look a little bit better when you take it. Oh, I'm forgetting to show you spikes, sorry. And locks. These are all from Oxford, but you get the idea. So the story gets better, but I think it would be misleading to conclude that everyone in the United States has access to our common cultural heritage, or the bulk of it as represented by the books, prints, films, and recordings accumulated in our libraries, archives, and museums. So many people are on the outside looking in through barriers that they can't get through. We've only recently reached a point where this material can be made available on a grand scale thanks to digitization and the internet. We now actually have it in our power to create a digital library that will aggregate the holdings of our greatest research libraries and make them accessible to everyone. We have the funds, the technology, the know-how, and the determination to make it happen. We face obstacles, of course, how to link up data from incompatible sources in one interoperable system, how to curate the material and preserve it for future generations, how to overcome illiteracy and the grinding poverty that keeps most of the world's population beyond the boundaries of book culture. I don't want to minimize those difficulties, but putting them aside for the moment, I would like to concentrate on one problem that tends to go unnoticed, because it pervades our world so thoroughly that we accept it like the air we breathe, as if it were an inexorable element of everyday life. It is the power of commercialization. Commercial interests have blocked off channels of communication, and they are exacting tolls for access to information, all information, including the most valuable kind, which we can build into knowledge. The field of knowledge, Thomas Jefferson said, is the common property of mankind, end quote. But since Jefferson's day, the cultural commons has been increasingly appropriated by business interests. Now, you may be beginning to squirm in your seats with an uncomfortable feeling. Am I about to be harangued on this subject by some starry-eyed professor who doesn't know the difference between a business plan and a bow tie? Let me assure you that I respect the economics of publishing, the hard facts of library budgets, the imperative of sustainability, my least favorite word, and the drive of digital entrepreneurs. As an example of the hard realities that I have taken as my subject, permit me to inform you about the cost of academic periodicals. $29,000 for a year's subscription to the Journal of Comparative Neurology, $23,000 for 1 year of brain research, $20,000 for a year's subscription to Biochimica and Biophysica Acta. The price of scientific periodicals has increased by 10 times the rate of inflation since the mid-1970s. And it's still increasing at rates that vary from discipline to discipline between today roughly 4% and 9% a year. All of this, of course, while library budgets are shrinking and while the consumer price index remains relatively stable. 3 big corporations, Elsevier, Wiley-Blackwell, and Springer, publish 42% of all academic journal articles. In 2010, Elsevier's profit margin was 36% on revenue of £2 billion. These publishers have a stranglehold on the market, and they squeeze all the money they can get out of research libraries, which have to pay the bills from constantly decreasing resources and do so by cutting back on the purchase of books. 1 year's subscription to Tetrahedron, a journal that costs $40,000 a year, is the equivalent of something like between 400 and 500 monographs just for 1 year of one periodical. So while the amount of knowledge is increasing, the proportion of it that is available to the public is decreasing. Of course, public funds subsidized much of that research in the first place, virtually all of it. So you might think that the public should have access to the results of the research. The National Institutes of Health acted on that principle in 2007 when the U.S. Congress required that articles based on NIH grants be made available from an open access repository, PubMed Central. But lobbyists for the publishers blunted that requirement by getting the NIH to accept a 12-month embargo to prevent public accessibility long enough for them to cream off the demand. Not content with that victory, the lobbyists tried to reverse the NIH mandate in the so-called Research Works Act, a bill introduced in Congress in November 2011 and championed by Elsevier. The bill was withdrawn 4 months later following a wave of public protest, but the lobbyists are still at work trying to block the Federal Research Public Access Act, which would make all publicly funded research available to the public, possibly without an embargo. That knowledge belongs in the public domain. Taxpayers paid for it. But private interests want to appropriate it just as entrepreneurs fenced off common land during the enclosure movement in early modern England. Well, that takes me to the subject of the early modern world. So brace yourself. I'm going to offer a historical detour into that world and the subject of copyright, because I think it provides some perspective on the inroads of commercialization today. This was the period, roughly mainly 17th and 18th centuries, when culture became imbued with consumerism. Not that one should imagine any age when cultural goods were costless, nor any society where intellectual exchange took place free of conflicting interests in some kind of idyllic agora. Even Homer had to sing for his supper. But the interplay of two phenomena, intellectual property and commercial interests, is especially instructive if one considers the early history of copyright. So I would like to take a quick look at England and France during the 17th and 18th centuries, and then return to the Digital Public Library of America and copyright issues today. Notions of intellectual property remained ambiguous until, and even sometimes after, states passed copyright legislation. In Britain, 1710, Denmark, 1741, France, 1793, and Prussia, 1794. As printing spread through France in the late 15th and 16th centuries, the exclusive right to reproduce a text depended on a privilege granted by the king for periods that varied from 6 months to 10 years. By the 17th century, privileges, the word is very significant. It comes from the Latin meaning private law, privilege. Privileges had to be accompanied with the approbation of a censor and registered with the Parisian Guild of Booksellers and Printers. The guild's interests coincided with those of the state. At the high tide of Colbertism, mercantilism, and with the intervention of Colbert himself, the state gave the guild members the exclusive right to print and sell books. And while monopolizing the book trade, they policed it, inspecting imports and bookshops for illegal works. They exercised their power so ruthlessly that they crushed their competitors in the provinces and gained nearly total control of the publishing industry by 1700. A royal edict of 1723, extended to the entire kingdom in 1744, confirmed both the hegemony of the Parisian Guild and the will of the king to perpetuate it. Privilege, royal absolutism, and the dominance of a commercial elite went together. Meanwhile, however, the economy was expanding and the book trade along with it. Some more spikes to amuse you while I give you maybe too much detailed history. I'll try to not make it sound too recondite. So you've got an expanding commerce, and the book trade is expanding along with it. There's a flourishing literature, which, however, could not win the approbation of the censors. And that literature streamed to publishers outside France, who also pirated the privileged works of the Parisian Guild and did a thriving trade inside the kingdom through an underground distribution system manned by their allies among the provincial booksellers. So you've got a fascinating economic situation that grows up as a kind of counter force to the privilege system where you've got the state and monopolization by a tiny elite. The officials responsible for overseeing the book trade, especially two of them, their names may not be familiar to many of you, C.G. de Lamoignon de Malesherbes and Antoine Gabriel de Sartine, they served as directors of the book trade from 1750 to 63 and 63 to 74, respectively. They saw this situation and they struggled to stop the drain of capital outside France to these publishing houses, printing houses that circled France and that were making a pile of money by satisfying the demand for illegal and pirated books. These leaders of or officials in the book trade even sympathized with the Enlightenment and opened loopholes in the privilege system, quasi-legal authorizations known as permission tacite and simple tolérance, in order to permit the publication in France of some of the works of the philosophers. Malesherbes deplored what he called the odious monopoly of the Parisian Guild. He attributed the Edict of 1723 to its lobbying. And I'm going to underline this because it turns out we have lobbies today. So I'm trying to show you how they operated in the past. Malesherbes, the man in charge of the book trade, deplored the lobbying of the Guild. He attributed the Edict of 1723 to it, and he hoped to reform the system by issuing new edicts which would treat authors more liberally and provincial booksellers more equitably. Sartine prepared the way for reform by a series of studies, including a remarkable survey of all the printers and booksellers in France in 1764. In August 1777, when at last the Crown issued a new general code for the book trade, it embraced a modern notion of economic competition. It trimmed back the power of the Parisian Guild, and it celebrated authors for their contribution to culture. But it stopped short of endorsing the concept of copyright, which did not really exist in France. The author, it treated the principle of privilege as a grace, une grâce, granted to an author by the king. The author could cede the privilege to a bookseller for a sum of money. Royalties did not exist at that time, but the bookseller could not exploit it for a period longer than the author's life. However, and this is very interesting in the word of the legislation, to extend a privilege beyond the limit of the author's life would be, quote, to convert the enjoyment of a grace into a right of property, end quote. So explicitly, the concept of property in literary creation is refused by the king as late as 1777. Now, these edicts illustrate the conceptual as well as the institutional obstacles to modernizing the book industries under the Ancien Régime. The Crown clung to an antiquated model in which a guild did business by monetizing the grace of the king. Some leading philosophers of the Enlightenment who published their works outside France rejected the premises of the entire system. They advocated authors' rights, including freedom from censorship and full proprietorship in the products of their labor. And one of them, Condorcet, went so far as to argue that ideas themselves should be free and therefore unconstrained by exclusive rights of property. Diderot represented a more common view, namely that authors should enjoy perpetual rights to the texts they created. And I will quote from Diderot. This is one of the earliest French versions of full-blooded authorial property in the product of creation. It's always fun to quote from Diderot. He gets wound up. You'll hear the sentence growing and growing. What kind of property can belong to a man if he does not own the work of his own mind, the sole product of his education, of his studies, of his nightly labors, his time, his research, his observations, his most beautiful moments, the most beautiful instance of his life, his innermost thoughts, the sentiments of his heart, that proportion of himself that is the most precious and that immortalizes him, end quote. Very Diderot, but in a way very modern. This passage expresses the new concept of genius. It's really an 18th century idea and the growing prestige of writers, which would culminate in what the French call the sacre de l'écrivain, the apotheosis of the writer in the early 19th century. But, and this is the sort of undertone that accompanies the wonderful Diderot rhetoric, Diderot embedded this notion in a memorandum addressed to Sartine, the official in charge of the book trade, when Sartine was contemplating reforms that would restrict the power of the Parisian Guild. So I'm back to my thesis of lobbying. Diderot's acting as a kind of lobbyist. He wrote the memorandum at the behest of his publisher, André-François Le Breton, who was then the syndic, the chief officer of the Guild. And for all of its eloquence, his argument could be interpreted as lobbying in favor of the Guild's interests. At that time, authors could obtain a privilege for their work, but they could not legally profit from it unless they sold it to an official bookseller who, as a member of the Guild, enjoyed the exclusive privilege of selling books. If, as Diderot argued, the privilege were perpetual, it would be far more valuable than if it were limited to the usual 9 or 10 years. The Crown refused to make such a concession. In fact, it failed to implement most of the reforms that it proclaimed in 1777. The Parisian oligarchy protested, lobbied, blocked action with a lawsuit, and continued to dominate the publishing industry until 1789. It took a revolution to break its monopoly and to convert the archaic notion of privilege into a modern concept of copyright. The revolutionaries proclaimed the liberty of the press in 1789, they abolished guilds in 1791, and they passed a copyright law in 1793, which limited the exclusive right to sell a text to the lifetime of the author plus 10 years. Now, of course, the story does not stop there, but this abridged version should be enough to illustrate the interpenetration of economic interests and legal principles in the early history of intellectual property in France. That's France. Now let's take a quick look at England, and then we can switch back to the 21st century. This is actually my college, St. John's College, and this wall is about 10 feet high. And if you look at the spikes, I mean, it wasn't easy to climb over a wall like that, I assure you. There's another view. You see the spikes in the background. Spikes are all over the place in Oxford. They keep the public out. So a similar mixture of commercial and cultural factors marked the history of books in England a century earlier. In 1644, Milton expressed the same view of authorship that Diderot was to develop in 1763. So I'll now give you a dose of Miltonian rhetoric in which you will hear the same basic idea. For books are not absolutely dead things, but do contain a potency of life in them, to be as active as that soul was whose progeny they are. Nay, they do preserve as in a vial the purest efficacy and extractions of that living intellect that bred them. A good book is the precious lifeblood of a master spirit, embalmed and treasured up on purpose to a life beyond life, end quote. I mean, they're famous lines, wonderful Miltonian rhetoric, but Milton wrote in the midst of a revolution, not on the eve of one like Diderot. And unlike Diderot, he did not bend his argument to support the privileges of a guild, the London Company of Stationers, established in 1557. On the contrary, he heaped scorn on what he called the old patentees and monopolizers in the trade of bookselling, end quote. He called for liberty of the press, within limits, no libelous, atheistic, and Catholic works were to be tolerated, and he treated the Guild as an obstacle to liberty. Like its Parisian counterpart, the Stationers' Company controlled publishing and the book trade by virtue of a monopoly granted by the Crown. It too functioned as a custodian of literary property by keeping a registry in which it entered licenses for the exclusive right to sell copies of a book. According to licensing acts renewed regularly by Parliament, books had to be approved by a censor or licensor before they could be registered and published. They could also be licensed by means of patents issued through the Royal Court of Star Chamber. But in challenging the power of the Crown after 1640, the Long Parliament abolished Star Chamber and let the Licensing Act lapse. For a brief period, from 1641 to 1643, the company feared that it would lose the legal basis for its exclusive rights to copies. We don't have copyright yet, but they are asserting rights to copies. It therefore lobbied Parliament to renew the Licensing Act. This is in the middle of a revolution. After Parliament complied in 1643, Milton discovered that his tracts on divorce could not be published legally until a licensor had approved them. His protest, Areopagitica, in 1644, fell on deaf ears, although it is echoed through the centuries as one of the earliest manifestos for the liberty of the press. The restoration of the Stuarts in 1660 did not augur well for liberty. In 1662, a particularly severe licensing act reinforced the monopoly of the Stationers' Company with provisions for censoring texts and policing the book trade that smacked of the absolutism then being developed under Louis XIV, who was, of course, the protector of the Stuarts in France. I don't know how much Tudor-Stuart history you've had, but this is pretty standard stuff, really. In 1688, the next round of revolution swept away the proto-absolutist Stuart state, and with it, 7 years later, pre-publication censorship. Once again, the Licensing Act had expired, and again, the Company of Stationers lobbied to restore it. But Parliament had become increasingly wary of the company's commercial hegemony. When John Locke examined the proposed bill for renewed licensing, he did not actually invoke the natural rights, liberty of the press, that he had defended in his second treatise on civil government. Instead, he deplored the perpetuation of a monopoly. So I'm trying to show you how these commercial lobbying, monopolistic interests are pervading the early history of copyright. True, he opposed the bill on the grounds that every man should be free to publish his views and answer for them afterwards. But his main concern was to break the power of the Stationers' Company, whom he despised as, quote, dull wretches who do not so much as understand Latin, end quote. The anti-monopoly view prevailed in Parliament, which put an end to pre-publication censorship by refusing to renew the Licensing Act in 1695, a great moment in the history of the liberty of the press. Now, although the lapse of licensing can actually be seen in retrospect as a great victory for the freedom of the press, it appeared at the time to be primarily a triumph over a commercial lobby, and a limited one at that, because the Company of Stationers continued to dominate the book trade without relying on acts of Parliament. Its members had not bothered even to register most of the books they published in the 17th century because they could shut out competitors by monopolistic practices. They also owned shares in a cartel known as the English Stock, which gave them a monopoly on steady sellers like almanacs, and an oligarchy within the company dominated the wholesale trade by combinations known as conjures. Now again, this may sound awfully recondite, but imagine this tiny group of powerful publishers utterly controlling the trade just when it begins to open up legally. The end of licensing threatened to open the way to competition because it meant that most works would fall into the public domain as soon as their licenses had expired. Anxious to secure a legal basis for their exclusive rights to copies, the company lobbied Parliament again. So this is after 1695, the expiration of the Licensing Act, and Parliament complied by creating the first law of copyright, a term that did not actually spread through the English language until the 1730s. So we've got an adjustment even of language to this new idea. But Parliament did not give the lobbyists everything they wanted, far from it, as indicated by its title. That's the Statute of Anne in 1710, it promised to promote a public good, quote, an act for the encouragement of learning by vesting the copies of printed books in the authors or purchasers of such copies during the times therein mentioned, end quote. And it limited those times to 14 years, renewable once, and to 21 years in the case of works whose licenses had not yet expired. 14 years renewable once. Do you know how long copyright lasts today in the United States? I'll get to that in a minute. The new rules of the game came into play in 1731 when the first copyrights expired. But the members of the Stationers' Company attempted to undo the action of Parliament by invoking what they took to be a general principle inherent in common law. Now we're getting closer to what I hope will be a happy ending. This is the main entrance to the Boston Public Library, and you see "Free to All" sculpted over the door. So this is the argument of the Stationers' Company. When an author created a work, he acquired an unlimited right to the product of his labor. If he sold the work to a publisher, the publisher owned it in perpetuity, as if he had bought a parcel of land. The argument ran parallel to Diderot's case for perpetual rights, and it gained momentum as the prestige of authors increased throughout the 18th century. Leading jurists like William Murray, Lord Mansfield, defended famous writers like Alexander Pope on the grounds that they should enjoy unlimited rights to their literary property. But behind that argument, the political elite continued to detect the danger of a commercial monopoly. And in Donaldson versus Beckett, it's a decisive case in the House of Lords in 1774, copyright was again limited to 14 years renewable once. The Founding Fathers faced the same need to weigh the relative importance of commerce and culture when they drafted the United States Constitution. They followed British precedent in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8, which gives Congress the power, quote, to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries, end quote. The first federal copyright law, passed in 1790, set those limits at 14 years, renewable once, exactly as in the Statute of Anne, and it too presented itself as, quote, an act for the encouragement of learning, end quote. From the beginning, therefore, the Anglo-American tradition of copyright struck a balance between two considerations: the public good, defined as the promotion of learning, and private interests limited to a relatively short period in which authors and publishers could profit from sales. Have we got the balance right today? The Soni Bono Copyright Term Extension Act of 1998 set the limits of copyright at the author's life plus 70 years, or 120 years in the case of works created by corporations like Disney. Jack Valenti, the head lobbyist for the Hollywood interests that pushed that law through Congress, was asked whether he actually favored perpetual copyright. Certainly not, he reportedly replied. Copyright should last forever minus 1 day. The law has tipped so far in the favor of private interests that most books will not enter the public domain for more than 100 years. The vast majority of works published in the 20th century have fallen into what librarians call a black hole. They cannot be digitized and made available free of charge on the internet without violating copyright. Having recovered from their setback in the Age of Enlightenment and rewritten copyright law to their own advantage, commercial interests are now redesigning the digital landscape. The internet and the World Wide Web were meant to be open to all, but private corporations have appropriated so much digital territory and erected so many fences around it that the public is being excluded from what should be its own domain. Now, I defer to the legal experts who know far more about copyright than I do, but I think it fair to conclude that commercialization has accompanied copyright from its origins, and necessarily so, because books are objects with commercial value. Publishers have always struggled to profit from them, and the struggle has involved exploiting every possible advantage, whether through guilds, cartels, monopolies, or lobbies. The discourse on authorship, even in the hands of great writers like Milton and Diderot, is haunted by the specter of monopoly. Book history in general, I think, is more Balzacian than Jeffersonian. It's a tale of lost illusions, illusions perdues, especially if one expects it to follow a progressive trajectory that will lead to a happy ending in the present. The issue today is not whether economics should displace democratization or vice versa, but rather how we can find a just equilibrium between the two. If access to knowledge has been closing, how can we open it up? Consider Google Book Search. Originally, it was a great idea. Thanks to its technological wizardry, its energy, its wealth, and its sheer chutzpah, Google set out to digitize all the books in the world's greatest libraries. But at first, it provided only a search service. You searched for a subject, and Google showed you where it appeared in a particular book with snippets of a few sentences, accompanied by some discrete advertisements to illustrate its use. Sometimes Google even told you where you could find the book in a nearby library. Librarians were delighted, readers amazed. But in working its way through the collections shelf by shelf toward a goal of digitizing every book in existence, Google stepped over the line that divided books in the public domain from copyrighted books. In 2005, the Authors Guild and the Association of American Publishers sued Google for infringement of copyright. For 3.5 years, the parties negotiated over a deal that would satisfy the interests on both sides. When they announced the result, while filing a settlement with the Southern Federal District Court of New York on October 28, 2008, the search service had metamorphosed into a commercial library which would sell subscriptions for access to its digital database. Google would get 37% of the profits, the authors and publishers 63%. So if you read the settlement, which isn't a lot of fun, it's about 150 pages of terrible legalese, you get the impression they're dividing a pie. They're trying to make money. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what publishers do. They're a commercial operation, and we all want authors to make money, so why worry? Well, I worry because the libraries which had provided the books free of charge to Google in the first place were being asked to buy back access to the digitized version of their own books at prices that would be set by Google and the plaintiffs, and that could escalate as disastrously as the prices of academic journals. The public was not consulted, and no public authority was empowered to oversee the enterprise. On March 23, 2011, the district court judge rejected the settlement. Among his objections, he noted the danger pointed out in two memoranda supported by the Department of Justice that Google book search could stifle competition in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Although he set conditions for revising the settlement, they do not conform with Google's business plan, and therefore it seems to me, anyhow, that the settlement is dead. Google will find plenty of lucrative uses for the information it has accumulated, but it failed in its attempt to create a closed commercial library greater than anything ever imagined. Its failure demonstrates the limits to commercialization in the modern age of information, and also the dangers, because it seemed for a while that a commercial enterprise could fence off an enormous stretch of our common culture in order to exploit it for its own profit. Google had threatened to dominate the world of digitized books even more thoroughly than the Parisian Booksellers Guild and the London Stationers Company had monopolized the trade in printed books 3 centuries earlier. If I may revert to a homiletic mode, I think there are 2 lessons to be learned from Google Book Search. First, that it is possible to build a macro-digital library. Second, that such a library should be designed and run for the public good. On October 1st, 2010, long before the court refused to endorse the settlement between Google and the plaintiffs, a group of leaders from foundations, libraries, and computer science met at Harvard to discuss the possibility of creating a Digital Public Library of America, DPLA. This is one of the illustrations made during one of our meetings. That is a non-commercial library that would make the cultural heritage of America available to all Americans and to everyone in the world with access to the internet. The foundations would combine forces to provide the funds. The libraries would cooperate to furnish the books. We created a steering committee and a secretariat located at Harvard's Berkman Center. Grants from the Sloan and the Arcadia Foundations covered initial expenses, and 6 work groups scattered across the country tackled the most important problems. What would be the scope and content of the DPLA's holdings? What sort of public should it envisage serving? How would its technical infrastructure be designed? How would it develop a sustainable business model? How would it be organized and governed? And how would it address legal problems, above all, the constraints imposed by copyright? So I'd like to discuss them briefly, and then I hope there's... Am I going on too long, Michael? We're okay for timing? Now, I confess I'm not a lawyer, I'm just an historian, but I will give you my view in historical perspective of some of these issues of copyright. We know that we want the DPLA to serve a broad constituency, not just faculty in research universities like Davis, but students in community colleges, ordinary readers, K through 12 school children, seniors in retirement communities, anyone and everyone with an interest in books. We are perfecting a technical prototype which will link the holdings of many research libraries in a single interoperable distributed system. We have funds to set up headquarters, probably somewhere far from Harvard, and designed to operate as a non-profit organization in conformity with the 501c3 provision of the tax code. The DPLA will be up and running within a year, and its initial holdings will include, among other things, a dazzling array of special collections far richer than anything available through Google. But how can it include books covered by copyright? We have not found a solution to this fundamental problem, but I would like to discuss a few possibilities as they appear to an amateur and as they have been actually formulated by some of the best professionals in law schools. We have learned from the history of copyright that we must accommodate the legitimate commercial interests of the book industry, not to mention other industries involved with other kinds of cultural products, such as images, recordings, and film. Now, for my part, but this, I'm just expressing my own opinion, not the view of the DPLA's steering committee, I think the DPLA should exclude books currently on the marketplace. It should create a moving wall to prevent its collections from spilling into the commercial circuits. By advancing a year at a time, the wall would maintain a distance of 5, maybe 10 years between the DPLA and books that are still in print. Now, I admit that the notion of in print is obsolete because publishers now work with electronic copy and they keep their backlists in digital databases so they can make any book available through print on demand or digital delivery to e-readers. But most books cease to sell after a few weeks, and their potential to produce revenue dries up completely within a few years. I see from your expressions some of you have published books like this. And I certainly have myself. The rare book that maintains its commercial value over a long time could be excluded from the DPLA by an opt-out arrangement with the publisher and the author. Far from threatening the economic interests of rights holders, the DPLA might in this way win their cooperation. True, opt-out provisions look dubious in court, and Judge Denny Chin, who refused to accept the Google settlement, rejected the opt-out clauses of the settlement. How then can the DPLA cope with the general problem of including books that are covered by copyright but are out of print, or as Google puts it, commercially unavailable? This vast category includes at least 1 million orphan books, maybe 2 million, that is, books whose rights holders cannot be found after a diligent search. They were published for the most part, not entirely, between 1923 and 1964. This category includes many millions published in the United States since 1964, the point at which copyright covers all books published in the US. And there are also millions published in Europe where the claims of rights holders could stretch back to 1870, according to some calculations. Could the DPLA make all these books available without exposing itself to litigation by invoking the famous Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976. That is, the doctrine of fair use. Google apparently meant to defend itself by a fair use argument when it was limiting its speculations to a search service. The DPLA might get more mileage out of that argument because it is a nonprofit organization devoted to the public good. It could claim that its use of digital files was not only fair, but, and this is a key word for lawyers, transformative, in that it had reworked a physical object which once had commercial value into an electronic ingredient of an open access database intended for education, study, and other uses that benefit the public. In doing so, moreover, it would not damage any market because the demand for the out-of-print books had dried up. Now, the opt-out provision, if legally acceptable, would provide an escape clause to that rare work that continued to sell after 5 or 10 years. And should any rights holder come forward with a credible claim, the book would be instantly removed from the DPLA's holdings, and the penalty for having made it accessible in the first place could be limited by legislation. In fact, one could imagine a moving wall at the far end of the time span when books would begin to fall into the public domain. The older the book, the smaller the sum to be awarded in case of copyright infringement. So I'm trying to describe some of the legal ways to minimize the risk of litigation. Unfortunately, however, copyright lawyers tend to be skeptical about fair use arguments, particularly those based on the notion of transformativeness. Some recent cases in the Ninth and Fourth Circuit courts may reinforce those arguments, but others, notably in the Second Circuit, undercut them. So we don't know what the status is of fair use arguments today. The Copyright Office is currently reassessing the case of fair use, which was developed by a particular study group called the Section 108 Study Group. And in January 2012, the Association of Research Libraries issued a Code of Best Practices in Fair Use, which encourages librarians to be bolder in making copyrighted works available as e-reserves for teaching. I don't know if any of you are librarians. The Copyright Office says, be bold. Well, librarians tend to be cautious. As things now stand, the penalty for copyright infringement can be and exceed $100,000 per title. The DPLA could be vulnerable to ruinous litigation because its holdings would consist of books digitized on a mass scale, and it would not be able to do due diligence in locating and notifying everyone who held their copyrights, especially in the case of orphan works. How then can it minimize the risk? A Copyright Office report of 2006 recommended congressional action that would limit damages according to certain criteria, such as the age of a book and the potential market for it. But the report did not hold out any possibility of escaping the crippling requirement for a book-by-book search to identify rights holders. Do you see what I mean? If you had to search for the rights holder of 1 million to 2 million books, you would never get anywhere. Now, one way around this difficulty may be through so-called extended collective rights arrangements and collective rights management organization, CMOs they're called, which have taken hold in Europe. Composed of members with rights to certain kinds of works, such as out-of-print books, the organization is legally authorized to negotiate licenses on behalf of its members and also for non-members with similar interests. It collects fees for the licenses and distributes the payment to the rights holders who can opt out of participating if they choose to do so. In Denmark, 44 groups of this kind participate in Copydan, the successor to an arrangement to pay authors for photocopying their works in the 1970s. In Norway, payments are made according to the number of pages of a digitized text that are read but not downloaded on a computer located in Norway. Similar systems exist in Sweden, in Finland, and the Netherlands. On March 1st, France passed a law that opens the way to the mass digitization of out-of-print books through the intermediary of a CMO that represents publishers who possess rights to print but not to produce electronic versions of works on their back lists. The CMO licenses them to publish online editions of those books, provided they do so within 3 years. If they fail to make the deadline, others may obtain a license. And the Bibliothèque Nationale de France may digitize and make accessible orphan books published before 2001 from its own holdings after a waiting period of 10 years. If the DPLA could benefit from this kind of system, it would be protected from exposure to litigation and relieved of the requirement to search for all the rights holders of all copyrighted out-of-print books, orphans included. So I just mentioned these European examples to give you some notion of the things going on in Europe. We're all working towards a solution of this very, very difficult problem. And finally, we could fall back on voluntarism. This country includes hundreds of thousands of authors who have published books that ceased to sell many years ago. Those authors would, I think, welcome an opportunity to give their books new life. They want readers. Many of them, especially in the academic world, never set out to make money from the publications in the first place. They want to communicate their ideas. They could license their rights to the DPLA, which would digitize their books, curate them, preserve them, and make them available free of charge to the entire world. Now, of course, they must possess those rights in the first place, and many authors, perhaps some of you here who, like me, never studied the fine print in your contracts, have unwittingly signed over electronic rights to their publishers. But you might persuade the publishers to relinquish those rights to a CMO, a nice gesture that would not be much of a financial sacrifice, since it would concern books that long ago had ceased to sell. Some authors have proposed transferring their rights to the DPLA through a legal arrangement similar to a Creative Commons license. Well, forgive me, please, if I'm overloading my argument with legalistic detail. I had to follow it where it led, and our quick tour through history brought us, I think, face to face with some arcane aspects of contemporary law. Inevitably, because the problems of copyright go back 3 centuries. The past haunts the present. But it can also provide some inspiration. Our concern with legal entanglements should not blind us to the utopian energy that has driven democratization from the time of the Founding Fathers. Given the opportunity, authors and publishers and readers of all kinds, I think, I hope, will rally to the cause. Their commitment can fuel the force that shaped the American Republic from its beginning. I mean, the pragmatic, can-do spirit that actually gets things done. Therefore, I would like to conclude with a promise. We will get it done. We will raise the funds. We will design the technology. We will organize the administration. We will even work through the legal problems, and we will get the DPLA up and running by April 2013. Thank you.
We do have time for questions. I think the best way to do it is if you do have questions, just queue up behind the microphone there. I'll go and turn it on, and then Robert will field the questions. The mic is ready.
So don't be shy. I mean, you know, I've dealt with lots of complex issues, and if some of them weren't clear, I'll try to clarify them. You might have strong opinions about some of these subjects.
I have two questions. My first one is, you mentioned the DPLA will try to make cultural heritage available to all, and I just want to know what constitutes cultural heritage. In this sense, I can think of two examples. One where Macaulay said, one shelf in the Oxford Library is worth more than the entire corpus of Indian literature. And then today, right, with ethnic studies departments being shut down, with books that are banned, I mean, is this going to be, if it's a government-run sort of organization, politics will obviously drive what books are available, and knowledge will still be constructed in a different way. Then my second question has to do with, I still don't see how the gates and spikes are pulled down in the sense that certain communities don't have access to computers, and maybe our attention should be driven to larger issues, and this seems to be focused on this one minor aspect of capitalism that's just centered around books when there's much larger issues going on. Thank you.
Well, I agree that I may have sounded obsessive about books. I admit I'm a book person. I love books, and there are other issues in the world. So I don't for a moment minimize the so-called digital divide. I think there's some grounds for optimism there, however, because it's not as if now everyone has to have a PC, full-scale computer. So many people in the so-called developing countries have smartphones and handheld devices of all sorts that I think the potential for access to the internet is growing. But I'm not minimizing the fact that it doesn't.
Technology, though, just talking about sort of the ideology around who should have knowledge and what kind of knowledge should be.
Yes. Yeah. No, I get it. That's the first part of your question. Well, we have, as I mentioned, 6 working groups. They're scattered all over the country. They have, lots of people have joined them. So what began as a tiny group that I invited to Harvard to discuss this issue has now grown into a fairly large but scattered organization. One of the working groups is called Scope and Content, and it's going to try to define what will go into the stock of not just books, but images, recordings, pictures, and so on of the DPLA. That has not yet been done. In any collection in a library, you are excluding things that you don't buy. So there are implicit cultural criteria that go into building up a collection. I completely take your point. In Harvard, for example, we are especially weak in South Asian materials. We have the oldest the oldest library in North America, founded in 1638 and so on. We've been building up collections for generations. But it so happens they're very skewed in one direction or another. And Harvard University woke up to the fact that it knew very little about South Asia about 10 years ago, began an effort to hire people, professors, to give scholarships to people, especially from India and Pakistan and other parts of South Asia, and then suddenly just assumed magically that we would have books for these new students and faculty to work with. We didn't have them. So that's a very good example of what you're saying, that there are large areas, even if you just restrict the discussion to the world of books, that are unbalanced. Now, my hope is that the Digital Public Library of America will take all of the holdings of the great research libraries, and that what is a weakness in one will be compensated by strengths in another. But certainly, although we don't have a well-defined policy yet, the working group is working on it, the idea that it would favor a certain sector of literature or a certain cultural component at the expense of others is, I think, abhorrent. And in fact, just 2 weeks ago, a group of Latinos sent me an email saying, we want to get Latino literature into the DPLA. How can we do it? And we are now working hard on that front. So it really will be ecumenical. I mean, it really will embrace the world's literature. In the case of Harvard, we have the largest library of Chinese books outside of China, except for the Library of Congress. And we've been digitizing them on a mass scale with the People's Republic of China. And all of our digital files will go into the DPLA. So it will be truly international. Excuse me, you had a question.
I'm very curious about this copyright that all of a sudden appeared. Do I have it right that this went from 14 years to 120 years? How does this compare with the rest of the world? And is there a workaround from 120 years back to 14 through another country, as apparently happened historically?
Well, that question goes to the heart of the matter. Now, the 120 years refers to corporate creativity, such as Hollywood films or Mickey Mouse. So the 1998 Sonny Bono copyright extension law is often referred to as the Mickey Mouse law, because Mickey was about to lose his patent, his copyright, and one of the things that Hollywood managed to do was to protect Disney's interest in Mickey Mouse. For most books, it's a matter of the author's life plus 70 years. That's a very long time, and it's very different from the 14 years that you mentioned. How did that happen? Well, we've had, I think it's, I may get the figure slightly wrong, but I think we've had 10 copyright acts or 11 copyright acts in the last 50 years. So Congress is constantly passing copyright legislation. And they don't just settle for changing the rules of the game, they change them retrospectively. So they have made works that had seemed to not be covered by copyright in the past, covered by copyright. It's a mess. And the Copyright Office in the Library of Congress does not have consistent records of who owns the copyrights. So I think what's happened is a gradual increase in the length of copyright pushed by lobbyists, but it also conforms with the Berne Convention and the prevailing norm in Europe, which is the author's life plus 70 years. So it's a worldwide phenomenon. I shouldn't blame it all on Hollywood. And it's one that I think should be reversed. But how are we going to reverse copyright law when the whole trend has been to increase it? You could argue that James Madison and Thomas Jefferson had it right. 14 years renewable once. 28 years is a long time. And myself, I think it's, how should I put it? Well, I think that we ought to reconsider the wisdom of the Founding Fathers. We've got a lot to learn from them.
I was wondering about the question of public domain. And initially, you seemed to kind of cast this this project in terms of public interests and commercial interests. And I wanted to ask you, perhaps, how do you see this pushing the envelope of what constitutes public domain, and whether initially you had talked about this several laws in Congress regarding the NIH and perhaps other public goods that might be in circulation under this legislation. I wonder if this could not might not also be available under DPLA. For example, would it not insinuate that all work in public universities, including, for example, professors here at Davis, all books published by the work of people in public universities, be open to the public?
Actually, that's a very interesting argument. I mean, you could, to take it further, say the work done by all of you, those of you who are on the faculty at Davis, really is subsidized by public money, by the California taxpayers. But even if you worked in a private university or college, a lot of public money would be behind that. So do you owe it to the public to make your publications truly public, that is available free through some kind of open access repository? You know, I wouldn't go so far as to wag my finger and say you owe it to the public, but I think it's a very good idea. Could we get legislation of this sort? Well, there is the so-called FERPA, FRPAA Act now being considered by Congress, which would make all research funded through taxpayers' money available to the public free of charge, not just in the medical sciences, as with the NIH policy, but all research. Will FERPA be passed by this Congress? I think there's not a very good chance. Should we have confidence in the ability of Congress to pass legislation for the public good? You know, it could be that the political situation will change in Washington. I don't know. But in facing something concrete like the DPLA, which we want to exist as an institution, instead of, you know, just talking, lamenting about the situation in Washington, in facing something concrete, we would have to get legislation drafted and passed by Congress. And that seems to me pretty unrealistic. I think it's probably more realistic to work on changing the law through court cases, pushing, for example, fair use as well as you can. And during supper, a group of us were talking about adapting text for the blind. That's a kind of fair use in which you can take copyrighted works and do so. And there's Brewster Kahle in the Internet Archive in San Francisco, who has a technique he's worked out of what he calls lending digital copies, one at a time. I mean, this isn't going to work for a library for the whole American or international public, but it's a first step. So I think it's a great idea. So we're pushing in as many directions as we can, but to be perfectly honest, we haven't got a solution to this fundamental problem. If we could get Congress to pass enlightened legislation, it would be wonderful.
I'm Steve Harris. I'm a grad student in history, but in a prior life I was corporate counsel to Project Gutenberg, so I've been down some of these roads. I share your skepticism certainly about the current Congress. I'm also pretty skeptical about the court route as well. And so my question to you has to do, as some of these others, with what can be done without the changes to the legal system Whether you talk about an NIH-type process, as you just did, it seems to me that at a certain level, for a certain class of publications, universities are both the primary purchasers as well as the payroll of the authors. And so I was wondering, in your broader role now at Harvard, whether there's been discussion either at the Harvard level or more broadly among the universities about taking steps in terms of the structuring of faculty relationships and library relationships so that at least going forward, we can put a cap on this copyright issue for this pretty significant class of scholarly books.
I completely agree that we must do something within universities. After all, we do have some purchase. We have, if you like, leverage which we can exert. And I think it's our responsibility to do so. At Harvard, we are doing everything we can to promote open access. And that means, first of all, a resolution adopted, first of all, unanimously by the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, which obligates faculty members to deposit the digital copies of scholarly articles, articles that have been peer-reviewed, in a digital repository that we have set up, and to make them available to everyone in the world. Now, to protect the liberty of the author, we have an opt-out provision, or better, a waiver that is granted automatically. And we have had more than half of the faculty have already contributed articles to this repository, although it's only 2 years old. It's succeeding, but that's scholarly articles. What about books? Well, I think that we need to try to change the economics of publishing for university presses. And that's not easy because, of course, they're frightened about taking the plunge into the digital world and potential losses and changing their business plan. Better to stick with something that's worked, even though we've sensed the ground changing under our feet, than to assume too many risks. Yeah, please, if you...
That's what they said at General Motors.
Right. I think we should be ready to take more risks. But what has amazed me since I've become the university librarian is the conservatism, not just of the university, but especially the importance of the Office of General Counsel. They're wonderful people, university lawyers, but their job is to protect universities against lawsuits. And I'm just, every time it's very hard to get changes in behavior of that sort without someone saying, don't risk exposure to litigation. In the case, if I may revert to journal publishing, because it's so central, it's so expensive. The increase of journal prices has been so great that if we could solve that one, our libraries would be in a much, much stronger position. We have a program to subsidize processing fees to faculty who publish in open access journals. So a faculty member can get $1,000 if that's what it costs to publish an article in an open access journal paid for by the university. Many scientists have such publishing fees in their grants. Others do not, so then they can go to the university. And Harvard, along with some other Ivy League schools, and I believe it's Stanford, certainly MIT, I forget how many universities have signed on to this now, have sponsored a general plan to try to get universities throughout the country to subsidize processing fees, what some people call authors' fees, in order to promote open access publishing of articles. I think that's ultimately the answer. I mean, I think we have to stand up to the extortionate pricing of publishers. But what we really need is an alternative, and that will be open access journal publishing. Now, there are proposals to do the same thing for books, and one is a kind of Groupon scheme in which university libraries would guarantee to buy a certain number of copies of a book that is proposed by university presses. And if enough of us can get together to guarantee a return that would cover the costs plus a little bit of profit, then the publisher would be free of risk, which is a big deal in book publishing, get a decent profit, and then we could make that book available free of charge to the rest of the world. We could go also, those of us who would pay, get certain advantages in print-on-demand editions and that kind of thing. So we're attempting to, little by little, to have different projects that would improve the general situation. But there's a great deal more that needs to be done. And from your experience with the Gutenberg project, if you've got ideas, I'm a taker. Thank you.
Hello, Beverly Wilcox. I'm a grad student in musicology. You illustrate, it won't stay up. There we go. There we go. You illustrated your lecture with pictures of barriers around books. And we've spent most of the time talking about barriers placed by rights holders and publishers, but those barriers were placed by libraries. And that's a problem that continues today. Today is May 2nd, and that's the day that the Bibliothèque Nationale's Department of Reproduction rates went up to 75 cents a page. As you know, when you publish an article, some of the most difficult struggles can be acquiring the rights to materials you have gained from libraries. Since you wear two hats here as both an author and the head of a library, could you talk about where the balance of rights should be between the public good and commercial survival for research libraries? Thank you.
You know, it's a wonderful question. I wish I had an adequate answer to it. I confess I don't. I mean, I'm with those authors who are willing to give over their rights to some kind of public good represented by the Digital Public Library of America. Since we make so little money from selling our books anyhow, it's not a grand gesture, but it's an important one, and I think it would make a difference. I didn't know that the BNF had increased its rates today. Of course, I've been someone who, for many, many years, has been paying money to the BNF for the right to produce an image or whatever. And it's a great problem. I think the problem is even greater in museums, where, which charge often enormous prices, $200 to reprint one image. But libraries are not exempt from that either. Now, in my view, libraries are not going to solve their economic problems by charging high amounts of money for reproduction rights. It's just not going to work. So why not just give it up and have a more liberal policy and address the problem where it actually exists? Now, as I said, I don't have an answer to the real problem, which is the escalating price of journals. And beyond that, the need to advance on two fronts, the analog and the digital at the same time. Because more books, you probably know this as a librarian, more books in print are produced each year than the year before. I mean, it's the idea that we live in a digital era is crazy. We do, but we live in a print era as well. And it's a cliche, it's a very misleading to say, well, everything's online, we don't have to worry about the printed book. I think it was in 2009 that, for the first time, more than 1 million new titles in print were produced worldwide. 1 million. And I think, I could be wrong, but I believe, according to Bowkers, that in the year 2011, 3 million new books were produced in print. We can't buy all of them, of course, but we can't pretend that they're not coming into existence. We must, I think, increase our collections of printed works, and yet more databases, more e-journals are produced each year. So the economic problems are simply enormous. How to deal with them as librarians? Again, I don't have an easy answer, but I do believe that no library can go it alone in the 21st century. I think we must make alliances with other libraries. And in the California system, I think you're doing quite well by sharing collection development. You have 2 huge regional off-site storages. I think, I could be wrong, but that you're cooperating quite well among one another. And you represent tremendous purchasing power. So at Harvard, we've recently created an alliance with MIT. I'm trying to work things out with some other libraries so that we don't attempt, we never bought everything. But I think now what we should do is to concentrate on strengths, to decide what in our collection development we want to favor without attempting to do everything. But as soon as you favor this thing, you disfavor that thing, and your faculty raises hell. So we have to do it with faculty cooperation, and we have to bring the faculty in to our collection development strategy, which we're doing. I mean, we've created a new faculty advisory council in the Harvard Library, and so on. I could go on and on and on. I still haven't answered your question, however. I take your basic point, which is libraries should change the way they behave and not simply point an accusing finger at publishers. It would be great if we could get the publishers to cooperate with us. And some will. You know, some, I think, really are mindful of the public good. So there we are. That's the best I can do by way of an answer.
You've just raised the problem of so many more books being published every year. I remember as a student at Harvard looking at library from the inside and out and thinking to myself, too many books. And there are more coming out every year. Where are you going to put them all? And so digitization seems like a terrific answer to this. And in fact, I use digitized research materials all the time, and they're a great boon. But then when you talk about the sort of national cultural heritage and putting them all in a digital library, I'm wondering what's going to happen to the public library across the street from where I live, which has the works of Hawthorne and Mark Twain and you know, the whole shebang. And are these going to sort of disappear in the digital age?
I shouldn't predict the future. You know, I have enough trouble with the past. But I'm often asked that question. We all ask that question of ourselves. We love our neighborhood libraries. I think we have a great tradition, the Carnegie Library and so on. Here's one example that might make you feel better about the local library. And that's the example of the branch libraries in New York City. I'm a trustee of the New York Public Library. We care about our branches, not just the famous library at 42nd Street and 5th Avenue. There are 87 branches. They have never been so full. People pile into them. And they do so for many different reasons. Some people want DVDs or videos. They want all kinds of things. Many of them want help in learning English. There are a lot of school children who come for help with their homework, which is provided by the librarians. Above all, there are people who need to find their way through cyberspace. That exists for our students at Harvard, as well as the comparatively underprivileged people in the North Bronx. Why? Because it's so confusing. It's so hard to get at the pertinent material. I mean, Google search will take you a certain distance, but not far enough. So librarians, I believe, are developing new skills which are adapted to the digital era, and they are helping people locate the pertinent information, which is, at least in my experience, often very, very difficult. Now, among the needs of these people are jobs. If you're out of work and you're looking for a job, you can't go to the want ads of your newspaper because newspapers no longer print want ads. There are a few, I agree, very few compared with the past. They're all online. Well, suppose you don't have access to the internet. You don't have a computer, you don't know how to use a computer, and you don't have a job. You go to the neighborhood branch office of the library in New York City. And this is true of libraries throughout the country. So there's this other function at a time of very severe recession, which is helping people locating jobs. So I think maybe let's hope the recession will be behind us and people will have more employment. But the librarians, I think, will continue to develop functions of a sort that are adapted to this new hybrid age in which printed books and electronic books exist simultaneously. Furthermore, I'm convinced that many people will continue to love to read books printed on paper. It was a great machine, the Codex, a book that you can read by turning pages rather than unrolling it, an invention that took place we don't know when, around the time of the birth of Christ. I don't see that going out of existence anytime soon. It's, as I say, more books like this are being produced all the time, and they're selling, some better than others. But I think that people will continue to use such books, and they'll use them along with electronic readers. I think it's quite wrong to see the two as incompatible. In fact, one of the lessons of the history of books is that one medium of communication does not displace another. I mean, the radio did not kill the newspaper, and TV didn't kill the radio, and the internet didn't kill TV. What happens is you get a richer and richer environment with more formats, more modes of communication. So I think the local library, as one example of a nodal point in a communication system, will continue to flourish. Maybe that sounds Pollyannish, but I really think that's the case.
Hi. At the beginning of your talk, you said that you weren't going to harangue us with this utopian vision of what the DPLA could do, and that was kind of disappointing to me because I would like to be harangued along these lines. And the reason I say that is because I think this would be a really nice thing to exist. I think most of us in this room would be a nice thing to exist, but I kind of want to explore why that is. If we're going to take on a project of anything of this size, right, you have to make arguments about how this could change the country. And that's a debatable topic in and of itself. Just to kind of give you an example of how I'm thinking about it, it's a common cultural trope for people to say, information is power. This is a highly dubious statement, because if information was power, academics would be the most powerful people on the planet. And this is clearly not the case. So my natural inclination is to be really enthusiastic about this, but I think there should be this argument made about why this is a good thing and how this could change our country and maybe the world. So if you're going to make that argument, what would you say?
That's quite a challenge. I would stress, first of all, that the Digital Public Library of America is not going to be a luxury for college professors. Some of my best friends are college professors. I like college professors, and many of you are, but the point isn't simply to make great esoteric research material available to our fellow professors. That'll be part of it, of course. I see the DPLA myself as aimed at a very broad constituency. And in this constituency, one group that, at least to me, stands out is community colleges. It seems that community colleges are underfunded, but are tremendously important for the lives of lots of people who have been a little bit on the margin and want to have a higher education and to get ahead in life. But many community colleges don't have decent libraries. What the DPLA will do will be to make available to them something, now I'm getting a little bit utopian maybe, but something as greater than the Library of Congress, free of charge. In any case, we will make available to community colleges the basic wealth of our research libraries, and I've been in touch with them. We want to invite them into the planning of the DPLA. We want them to define their needs and how they can shape the development of this new library in such a way that it will benefit their students. So that's maybe a concrete example of how the DPLA can make a difference for a very large segment of the population. You know, roughly half of the undergraduates in this country go to community colleges. So that's one example. I think of also lots of isolated individuals who want to write a book or to get up a subject or are just curious about something or other. They can have the entire intellectual wealth of the country at their fingertips through the DPLA. I think of people in retirement homes or nursing homes, or even K through 12 schools who could use this. But we have to not just make it available and then sit back as if the job is done. I think what we need to do is to try to encourage grassroots development so that people in small towns, for example, can have their resources digitized and made part of the DPLA. So one program we are experimenting with, we will this summer, is what we call Scanabagos. We imagine something like a Winnebago with scanning machines going around to small towns and digitizing the holdings of some small libraries, historical societies, and so on, and helping them then develop these collections and curate them to reach out to their own communities and maybe get people to contribute things from their attics, etc. So these are ways in which the DPLA can make a difference for the lives of ordinary people, not just the elite. And I think that as we get into it, we will discover new functions, because something like this, as it takes, draws people in, and they have ideas. So we're finding this happening all the time. It happens technologically. There are so many ideas for apps to our basic platform that I can't keep track of them or even begin to understand them. But it's an exciting project that I think will actually touch the lives of millions of people and will make a difference. So, I keep getting stuck.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Professor Darnton. I think that we just heard a marvelous rewriting of Jude the Obscure, and certainly a happy ending is being foreseen here. I do want to remind people that in the interest of the public good, we will have an open access reception where you can continue this conversation. And I want to have us all thank, once again, Professor Darnton for a really wonderful talk.